I'll bet most of you guys listening to this video today have one of these on your truck. These gauges have a lot of dials and numbers on them. Do they mean anything to you? What do you use these for? Saturation is the word to understand when reading refrigerant gauges. Saturation occurs in two places in the refrigerant cycle, in the condenser and in the evaporator. Saturation is where liquid and vapor refrigerant exist together. In the condenser, the refrigerant enters as vapor and begins condensing into a liquid as it is rejecting heat to the air flowing across the coil. When it exits the coil, the refrigerant is a subcooled liquid. The refrigerant then enters the evaporator coil as a liquid and begins evaporating into a vapor as it absorbs heat from the air flowing across the coil. The refrigerant then exits the evaporator as a superheated vapor. The pressure temperature chart for each refrigerant shows us the relationship of the pressure and the temperature. The temperature is what we are concerned with more than the pressure. So when looking at your refrigerant gauges, the main thing that you want to concentrate on is the temperature. The coil temperature. This is what we are really concerned with, and this is what the refrigerant gauge shows us. When you're looking at your refrigerant gauges, the low side gauge is telling you what the temperature is inside the evaporator coil as the change of state is taking place. The high side gauge shows you the temperature inside the condenser coil as the change of state is taking place there. Of course, you will need to know what the type of refrigerant is that you're working with, and this can be determined by the temperature-pressure relationship or by looking at the data tag of the unit to determine what type of refrigerant you're working with and which scale you want to be looking at on your refrigerant gauges. As we said, by taking the pressure reading from the refrigerant gauge, you will want to convert that to the temperature by either using a pressure temperature chart or by looking at the scale on your refrigerant gauges, as the temperature of the coil is what we are mainly concerned with to see if the system is properly charged and operating correctly. As a rule of thumb, the low side range for 410A would be between 102 psi to 145 psi. 102 psi converts to 32.5 temperature. So anything below 100 psi on your low side gauge and you would have a freezing coil. On the high side gauge for 410A, you can range from 200 psi to 480 psi depending on the outdoor temperature. All major manufacturers will give you a check chart for the different refrigerants and the different units, which will give you a ballpark figure for temperatures and the size of the unit as to what high and low side pressures you should be reading if the system is operating correctly. One of the main questions that we in the tech support group ask all the time to techs is, how's your airflow? And of course the answer that we always get is, it's good. So let's take a look at a practical example of how airflow can affect the readings on your refrigerant gauges. In this example, we have refrigerant R22 in the system, and on the R22 scale, we are reading 32 degrees, which means that our coil is freezing. So why is it freezing? Are we low on refrigerant, or do we have an airflow issue? So when the tech first got to this job, he noticed that he had a dirty air filter on the air handler. So when he got the low reading of a freezing coil on his gauges, he wanted to make sure that he had the proper airflow. So he changed the dirty air filter and put a new filter in the system. After changing the filter, our coil temperature climbed to 36 degrees. So airflow does matter. So before you start adjusting charge or making other decisions on the job, make sure that your airflow is correct. Check back next week for a video on how you can check your airflow, and instead of saying it's good, you know exactly what CFM you're moving through the system.
Go to arefco.com for more videos, like, subscribe, and check back every week for new videos.